You are attending an East-West Leadership webinar with Gabor Holch. I host these webinars more or less every month about two different issues. One of them is intercultural leadership in general, specifically what kind of skills business leaders must develop in order to be able to transport their experience and their expertise from one culture to a significantly different and therefore challenging other culture. And here, we are definitely going to learn an awful lot about how we can transplant and how we shouldn't transplant business strategy between Europe and Asia. And then this is the other topic, because we call it East-West leadership. So we usually think in terms of the West, which is generally understood as North America and Europe, and East Asia and South Asia. So I'm specifically interested in topics where these two geographic areas interact with each other. And why we are especially privileged to have Nicolas on the call today is because he's not only a strategic expert and not only has a deep insight into an area of East-West leadership, which I am not an expert on and I don't know an awful lot about, which is the impact of geopolitics and, if I understand correctly, even defense, which is becoming timelier and timelier. But also I consider him an expert of Japan and the relationship of Western countries, specifically European countries, with Japan.
One thing to start, it's interesting that pretty much everybody, and that includes the media, and that includes myself, and that includes you, Gabor, the fact that we call it the Carlos Ghosn case. My first argument would be that this is not the Carlos Ghosn case. Calling it the Carlos Ghosn case, it's already an ideological bias, a cognitive bias. It's already us falling into the trap laid by the Japanese side to make us believe that the whole thing, the whole case, the whole war between Renault-Nissan, it's about Carlos Ghosn. I usually joke to my clients about the fact that had it been Mickey Mouse or Batman, it would have been called the Batman case or the Minnie Mouse case. But it doesn't change anything. This was a case of economic warfare, of one economic power against another over the control of a strategic asset. It so happened that the person at the helm at that time was a gentleman with 3 passports, French, Lebanese, and Brazilian, called Carlos Ghosn, who had a massive ego, who had isolated himself at the top of what was back then the world's largest car manufacturing alliance, Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi. But had it been the current CEO, for example, or the current president of the alliance, which is with someone, I will tell you a bit more about him, of a completely different fiber, very old school, very paternalistic, very lame, some people would say, the war would have still gone on. Different tactics, different leverages, but the same war. Because the objective, and this is what I would like everybody to understand from the onset, the objective that the Japanese side had here was to weaken French influence in the alliance, to regain control of 2 major strategic assets. We have to remember that back then, before the arrest of Carlos Ghosn, Nissan is Japan's 2nd largest car manufacturer. Which country that has a philosophy of economic power, that has a high degree of patriotism, some people would even call it nationalism, including economically speaking, which country would accept that its 2nd largest car manufacturer is controlled by a foreign government? We have to go back in history a little bit. We have to understand how the entire Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance structure came about. First of all, analysis, we tend to believe that the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance was Carlos Ghosn's baby. It was not Carlos Ghosn's baby. The Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance was started by Carlos Ghosn's predecessor, Louis Schweitzer, who was back then, and we're talking about here the mid-1990s, who was the CEO of Renault. Carlos Ghosn was not the CEO of Renault back then. And Louis Schweitzer had a couple of realities to deal with when he was the CEO in the mid-90s. Renault was in a fairly strong financial position, quite a lot of cash on its books. Renault had one issue: research and development. Renault was struggling back then with putting out on the market like groundbreaking technologies, car models that would really shake the entire market. And Renault was struggling with market shares in some key markets, especially in North America. I mean, for those of you who had been traveling a lot before COVID and who were lucky enough to travel to get back on the road after COVID, did you see many Renault cars in the US, in the streets of New York or Washington or Denver or Los Angeles? No, maybe a couple. Probably the cars of the head of the French consulate or the head of the French international school. That's about it. So Renault was suffering from this lack of sizable market share in North America. Louis Schweitzer knew that the car market, the world car market, was on the verge of a massive, decade-long consolidation. The consolidation had started. I mean, the big guys in Detroit were starting to feel the pinch from many of the macroeconomic policies that the Fed had put through. They were starting to consolidate. So Louis Schweitzer at Renault knew that for Renault to continue and to remain in the top league, they had to find a suitable partner, suitable in terms of technology and in terms of market share. Remember, Renault had the cash back then. And where Louis Schweitzer was really good is that he identified Nissan as an appropriate partner for this. Nissan was precisely in the opposite situation as Renault. Fantastic market shares throughout, in Asia, in Europe, in North America. A real leader in terms of research and development. Nissan was at the forefront with the likes of Toyota. This is not to say that Nissan was the only one, but at the forefront with the likes of Toyota on groundbreaking technologies. And we're thinking here about electric vehicles, hybrid, etc. Nissan, however, in the mid-90s, was in a catastrophic financial condition. Nissan had lost so much cash and dug into its coffers so much because they were trying to acquire market share at absolutely any cost. So they were selling at a loss in North America to capture market share, thinking that once we have a 20% market share, then we can start pricing up our cars a bit more and recovering profitability. So the Japanese, Nissan being the second largest car manufacturer, were in front of this situation. Strong in market share, international presence, strong in R&D, extremely weakened financially speaking. At one point, Nissan was on the verge of collapse, financially speaking. So Louis Schweitzer of Renault came to the Japanese in the mid-90s and said, this is what I'm proposing. Mitsubishi will come later. Mitsubishi is something that Carlos Ghosn will bring on at a later stage. Louis Schweitzer said, I propose that Renault takes a 43% share in Nissan. This is the 43% here, with voting rights, obviously. And in return, Nissan will have 15% shares into Renault with no voting rights. Because, I mean, come on. The balance of power is in Renault's favor. You have no cash anymore. We're going to basically bail you out. And what we're interested in is your market shares and your R&D. So this is to say that the Japanese are extremely realistic, very pragmatic. So for our Renault-Nissan case, they understood that they didn't have the upper hand. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. They had to say yes. So they accepted. They accepted 15% with no voting rights. For the first 10 to 15 years of the alliance, things were quite rosy. Louis Schweitzer put Carlos Ghosn in charge of turning around Nissan. So Carlos Ghosn was coming from Michelin. He had done quite a lot of cost cutting and turnaround at Michelin. He was hired by Renault to do the same in Japan. So Louis Schweitzer gave him a mission. You will be 6 months a year in Yokohama, in the headquarters of Nissan, and you will turn that company around, which he did. This earned him his nickname, the cost killer, because his number one policy was to absolutely kill cost at every levels at Nissan. He basically strangled suppliers, all the suppliers of Nissan. The idea would be, I'm building an alliance now. So you suppliers, you're not going to be selling to us 100 pieces from now on. You're going to be selling us 10,000 pieces. I'm buying your entire production of the year. But that means the margins, your margins have to be paper thin. So this way, he managed to really turn Nissan around. He closed Nissan factories. He laid off tens of thousands of employees. But the Japanese, being pragmatic, thinking that what is at stake is the survival of our second largest car manufacturer, they graciously did it. They looked down, rolled up their sleeves, got to work. So for the first 10 to 15 years, things were working out pretty well. The balance of power was clearly in Renault's favor. It started turning sour in the second half of the marriage, so approximately the mid-2000s up until Carlos Ghosn's arrest. Why did things turn sour? And this is where it gets interesting, because you see that there were a lot of weak signals that a rebellion had to be brewing at some point. A lot of weak signals, and we're going to go through some of them, and we're going to start an understanding what in Japanese culture, and especially in the Japanese culture of the economic power and patriotism, should have warned Renault that at one point the terms of this alliance had to be changed by Renault themselves if they wanted to avert any willingness of rebellion at one point. The first problem arose when the French government, which had still, historically speaking, 15% shares of Renault. It's a very old shareholding that the French government has at Renault. Actually, at one point, right after the Second World War, the French government nationalized Renault completely on the grounds that Renault had collaborated with the German occupiers. So as a punishment, Renault was nationalized. And then over the decades, the French government divested itself from Renault, with a big acceleration in the 1990s when President François Mitterrand started introducing his very liberal policies of state divestment and privatizations. But the French government was still holding on to 50% voting rights. And then suddenly, without telling Renault, without warning Carlos Ghosn in advance, they claimed that they deserved, in virtue of their 15% stake in Renault, double voting rights. The double voting right by the French government in the decisions at Renault was imposed on the grounds of we need to be able to protect national interests in case foreign investors want to weaken our companies from the inside. I'm not going to go into the details of the genesis of this double voting right and the law, the Florange law, that made it possible. It started because of a Lakshmi Mittal investment in the steel industry in France. But the French government was able to impose double voting rights. The problem is that they did it without warning Renault. So if you take a step back and if you put yourself in the shoes of Nissan, you're standing in Yokohama and you learn through the financial press, reading the Financial Times, that now what you thought was your largest shareholder, meaning Renault, is actually increasingly controlled by the French government, having double voting rights. And remember, you, Nissan, have no voting rights. So you start wondering, okay, who's my partner here? Who am I married to? Did I marry Renault, or am I actually married to the French government? Which is a whole different proposition if you take it in relationship with economic patriotism. It's a whole different proposition. And then, of course, Renault and Nissan are 50-50 in the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance, which is headquartered in the Netherlands for tax purposes. So this is really a first element, a first weak signal that tells you that this type of capital alliance, 15% voting rights for Nissan versus double voting rights for the French government, became tantamount, the equivalent of a capitalistic Treaty of Versailles for the Japanese. This is when the mid-2010s, the Japanese are becoming more and more vocal. They're asking Renault, we want to start discussions to rebalance the alliance. We deserve voting rights at the very least. We want voting rights. Why do they do this? Because remember, I told you when the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance starts, the financial balance of power is clearly in favor of Renault. Nissan is almost bankrupt. But Carlos Ghosn has done such a good job at turning around Nissan that right before the last financial year before the Japanese have Carlos Ghosn arrested, this is the balance of power between Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi. You have to look at the part in blue. The part in blue is the amount of cash that each component of the alliance owns. Look at the amount of cash that Renault has. Virtually no cash. The cash is in Nissan's coffers. You have to look at the black part, which is the value of the cross shareholdings. In 2018, most of the value, if not all of the value of Renault, is actually the value of its shares of Nissan. And then in red, it's what we could call the residual value, the intrinsic value of each entity. You see the problem here. Carlos Ghosn has done such a good job at turning around Nissan that now Nissan has the total control over the relationship. And remember, I will show you later, they're still ahead in R&D and market shares. That little pie chart here, this is the market shares. This is the global sales. The latest ones we have before Carlos Ghosn's arrest, 2017. 2/3 of the global sales of the alliance come from Nissan and Mitsubishi. This is your international presence, your visibility. It's mostly Nissan and Mitsubishi. So how long will the Japanese accept this kind of alliance controlled by a foreign government? They're asking nicely, they're asking voting rights. By the way, if we fast forward today, because this operation against Carlos Ghosn was so successful, at a price, at a cost for Nissan, but it was successful, they've achieved their goal, weakening French influence. Now they've managed to impose a complete rebalancing of the relationship. As we speak, Renault has only 15% share in Nissan anymore, and Nissan has full voting rights. So they managed, through an act of economic warfare, to gain more than what they were asking nicely before. If we look at the technological balance of power, here I'm looking at two extremes of the product line. On the left, you have the Renault Zoe, which is the full electric vehicle that Renault put out. And on the right, you have the Nissan Leaf, Japanese version. The Japanese put out the Leaf a good 3 years before the Renault Zoe. Leaf was on the market 3 years before Zoe. And most of the technology of the Renault Zoe is derived from the Nissan Leaf anyway, in virtue of what we call here the common module family, which is the real genius of Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn was under pressure from the French government to make the alliance indestructible, capitalistically speaking. He resisted pressure from the French government, telling the French government, the Japanese will be angry if I increase the capitalistic control that we have over them. Already, they are very uneasy with how things stand right now. Let's not touch that. What I propose to do instead is the CMF, Common Module Family. We will make sure that in every Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi factory in the world, up to 70% of the cars are produced on the same lines, which means 70% of the spare parts and the components of the Nissan Leaf are to be found in the Renault Zoe. This is a technical marriage, which will make this marriage stronger. But that means that the Japanese keep the upper hand. They are still in advance in terms of R&D. If we look at another extreme of the car offering, the performance cars. Granted, you usually sell those at a loss. Okay, you don't make money on those. But it's a good ambassador of how much technology and how much performance each builder is able to pack into one production car. There again, Renault is at a massive disadvantage. Renault has put out the latest version of the Renault Alpine. Renault Alpine, it's a nice car. It's a nice car. But it doesn't reach 300 kilometers an hour. It's very light on technology. And by the way, it had disappeared from the car dealerships for close to 40 years. This is the new version. Before that version, the latest one was from the 1970s. On the contrary, Nissan, with the GTR, which, by the way, the GTR beats a Porsche 911 Turbo for half the price. It's faster than a Porsche 911 Turbo for half the price. And the GTR at Nissan was uninterrupted since the 1960s. They've always put out, this is the latest version, obviously, but they've always put out Nissan GTRs. And the Nissan GTRs always won championships, rallying, racing championships. So there again, in terms of technology, the Japanese are getting angry. They're saying, we have the upper end technology. Most of what Renault puts out comes from our technology, and we still don't have voting rights. And we have the financial upper hand. So there, in terms of strategy, in terms of intercultural management, you have to put things together and start realizing that we're looking at an awful lot of weak signals that a rebellion is brewing. How long are we going to be able to impose that kind of partnership to those partners? Now it's, we need them. They've completely turned around the balance of power. Now you may be wondering, how come Carlos Ghosn, being given Nissan in a terrible financial state, how come he didn't take advantage of this to keep that balance of power in France's favor? Well, then that's when you have to incorporate elements about who the man is. I mentioned on purpose that, and this is no reflection on issues of morals, but it's a reflection on what patriotism means for him. The man has 3 passports. He's French, he's Lebanese, and he's Brazilian. And he's always presented himself as a man of the world, as a global CEO. When you're Renault, when you start seeing that you have a lot of weak signals that a rebellion may be brewing, it might be a good idea to get a pretty patriotic CEO to defend your position. Because when you have a CEO who considers himself a world CEO, who has as an only comparison the CEO of General Motors, the CEO of Ford, the CEO of Toyota, you have to start realizing that you may be in for big troubles. And that's exactly what we see here. Carlos Ghosn kept intact Nissan's advance in R&D, kept intact Nissan's advance in market shares, did nothing to turn that around in Renault's favor. He used the strength of each actor, Renault and Nissan, and he kept them intact and only tried to increase that level of power. But what should have been done here, especially if under French government pressure, you have no intention of offering a more balanced alliance to your Japanese partner, what you should have done at least is be coherent and go for a much more patriotic CEO who will make sure that the French keep the upper hand, which was not done. So there you have to reincorporate the Japanese culture of economic patriotism, what the Japanese consider as the paramount importance of remaining masters in your own house, not being controlled by foreign powers. The only foreign power that the Japanese have integrated is American power. That's the only one that they have totally integrated in their strategic foresight, in their view of the world, for very obvious reasons. North Korea, China. The only umbrella, and we have to be fair, I mean, it is absolutely obvious, the only umbrella that Japan can count on is the US military. But apart from the US military, Japan has difficulty, and I mean, I'm not going to blame them, I'm pretty patriotic myself. Japan has a lot of difficulty accepting being under influence and under control by a foreign power. With that kind of ideological bath that all large Japanese multinationals are in right now, you have no room for accepting control by a foreign power, especially when you see that there are differences of opinion on that side. Carlos Ghosn is confronting the French government every day back then. I'll give you one example. When Emmanuel Macron, the current French president, was still Minister of the Economy, he was asked, and he was preparing for his political campaign to become president, he was asked by journalists, do you think it's normal and do you think it's moral? We like to do that in France, put everything back to morals. Do you think it's moral that a man like Carlos Ghosn earns 2 salaries He's paid as the CEO of Renault, and he's paid as the president of the alliance. And do you think it's moral that those two salaries are taxed in the Netherlands, not in France? Emmanuel Macron was cornered into answering this. And he answered it like any politician in an election campaign would answer. He said, I understand that the French people are shocked by this. I will address this issue. And if we do not get a satisfactory answer from Renault and from the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance, I may legislate on it if I become president. So here you have the future French president threatening to legislate on the salary of Carlos Ghosn to force that salary to be repatriated in France and taxed in France. Again, you're in Yokohama. You have ideas of rebellion. This gives you the signal that hunting season is open. If you have the idea of attacking Carlos Ghosn, you know that he will not be protected by the French government. So a lot of bad decisions, a lot of weak signals ignored, a lot of elements of culture of power within Japan totally ignored. That meant that the Japanese could unleash this enterprise of destabilizing Carlos Ghosn, and through him having French influence collapse altogether. And this is the result now. Where do we stand now? And I think I should probably wrap it up for this long introductory comment, but I think those are elements of background that are important to remember. Where do we stand now? Carlos Ghosn was put in jail, then freed on bail, under house arrest. I mean, you remember the New Year's Eve caper when he was pulled out of Japan by two US special forces who basically brought him by train to Osaka, put him in a music box, boarded a private plane from Osaka to Istanbul, changed another private plane to Beirut. Now he's in Beirut, okay? He's, of course, still sued by Japan, on top of being sued by Japan for failing to declare a future income, for stealing money from Nissan, which is the most serious accusation. He's on top of that now a fugitive. But that's the beauty of it. If you're Japanese, you think, good riddance. Because now the guy can say whatever he wants. And you may have seen from the press that now he's suing Nissan for $1 billion with a B US dollar in damages. But who's going to believe a fugitive? The guy is a criminal that they couldn't judge, that they couldn't take to trial because he's a fugitive. Who's going to believe a fugitive? That's the beauty of it. My theory is that they let him go. I mean, Japan is a very controlled country. Okay, you don't come in, you don't go out just like that in a music box. You let the guy go at one point because you have nothing to gain from keeping him in jail or under house arrest until a trial. In a trial, what is he going to do? He's going to give names. He's going to explain and dig publicly with the help of his lawyers into everything he knows happened, and explaining in details what I've been doing for years, that this was an act of economic warfare by Japan against France through him. You don't want that kind of embarrassment. So now that you've managed to get him out of Nissan, board of directors, out of Renault, out of Mitsubishi, out of the alliance, let him go. He's going to be stuck in Lebanon. He cannot leave Lebanon because France also sues him. So if he goes to France, he could be arrested. Brazil doesn't care. I mean, you go to Brazil, nobody knows about Carlos Ghosn. So now he's stuck in a little corner. He can say whatever he wants. As far as I know, he teaches at St. Joseph University, some business classes, how to start a business, how to run a business internationally. That's all he can do. But the result is now that the Japanese have managed to force the hand of Renault to rebalance the alliance. As I said, now Japan has 15% shares of Renault with voting rights, and Renault has agreed to lower their own shareholding into Nissan from 43 to 15%. They won, and they even got more than they were asking for nicely before. And they did beautifully, because at one point, the cost for the Japanese for this war was what we call, a Pyrrhic victory. I'm showing you this. This is a Bloomberg chart that starts on the day of Carlos Ghosn's arrest, and it finishes on pretty much the day where he escapes Japan. And here you're looking at total return. So share price, to which you add payment of dividends. During that 1.5-year period, Peugeot was doing plus 920, Fiat Chrysler plus 3.5, Volkswagen plus 30.5, Daimler plus 4.7, Nissan minus 33.7, Renault minus 24.5. In terms of market capitalization, throughout the entire Carlos Ghosn case, Renault lost 5 billion euros in market cap. Nissan lost $12 billion in market cap. This is the cost. Again, share price and dividends. This is the cost of the Carlos Ghosn case, of the war. But I think we'll agree, total defeat for the French, what we call Pyrrhic victory for the Japanese. A victory, but at what cost? A victory that made sure that Nissan, it would take them years to recover from this, which they have. Now they've recovered. And then you have a few more issues that came after the Carlos Ghosn case, which the Japanese capitalized on towards the end of the Carlos Ghosn case. Fiat Chrysler, FCA, knocked on the door of Renault-Nissan and proposed an alliance. They say, we want to join the alliance because we know that with Tesla, with the coming of Japanese manufacturers, we need to continue our consolidation. So how about we get married together? The French government made that stop. The French government forced Renault-Nissan to demand some guarantees to Fiat Chrysler that every analyst knew that FCA could not accept. So FCA closed the door to that, and they went to Peugeot. So the French government had one massive opportunity to counterattack the Japanese by diluting them into a bigger ensemble. And the result is that Fiat Chrysler joined Peugeot to form Stellantis. Then you had the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. Because of the Western sanctions on Russia, Renault had to divest for one symbolic ruble from Avtovaz, the Russian car brand that they owned in Russia, which were extremely profitable. They had to sold it to the Russians for 1 ruble. And now, with the whole advent of electric vehicles, Renault is proposing to split into 2 different entities: combustion engine, which will be called Horse, and electric vehicle, which will be called Ampere. For Horse, the Chinese, Geely, and the Saudis, Saudi Aramco, are threatening to come in pretty aggressively, and they could take control of Horse, the combustion engine part of Renault. So Renault on that part could become Chinese and or Saudi. So they begged Nissan to join Ampere, the electric vehicle. And Nissan used it as leverage to force a lowering of Renault's share and to force Renault into giving them full voting rights. They say, we'll accept to invest 50% into Ampere only if you lower your share in us down to 15%, and if we have full voting rights. Otherwise, we're not talking at all.